Hi, I'm Phil Chambers. This is a bit of a departure from my normal series of talks on health and safety. And this is about aircraft. I'm going to do two talks on this, one about the V-bombers and another one about TSR-2. So we'll start with the V-bombers, which goes back to just after the Second World War. And what happened during the Second World War was the UK provided scientists and all the data from our Tube Alloys project, that was the atomic weapons project, to America, which they used in their Manhattan project to produce the atom bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But at the end, and the agreement was that we would have that data back. But at the end of the Second World War, there was the McMahon Act, which says that no information on nuclear weapons is going outside the UK. So the government at the time, and this is surprising because it was the Labour government, actually says, we will develop a nuclear weapon. Bearing in mind that we were strapped for cash, and we were doing lots of adventurous things like starting up the NHS, national insurance and all of that. But we actually decided to produce a nuclear weapon. We had no way of delivering it, and so it was necessary to produce an aircraft. So we came up with the concept of a requirement for an aircraft to deliver this nuclear weapon to Russia, basically, because that's who we're up against. So it was one requirement: provide a high-speed, high-altitude delivery aircraft. Of course, the concept was that if we went high enough and fast enough, then nothing could catch you. Certainly, fighter aircraft couldn't catch you. So we had one requirement, and we ended up with 4 aircraft, believe it or not, 4 different designs. And these were the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, Handley Page Victor, and one that nobody's really heard of, but it's the short Sperrin. I'll tell you more about all of those as we go along. But look at the specification. The first one was B1446. 46 refers to the year in which it was raised. So that was raised in 1946. So just after the Second World War. And it was to carry this special weapon. Didn't say anything more than that, what it was. But it was in this massive bomb bay, 10 foot by 10 foot by 30 foot. That's the size of a shipping container. Huge bomb bay. Range of 3,800 miles, so that's a radius of 1,900 miles, altitude 45,000 feet, and there was no mention of any speed or wing shape or anything like that in the specification. And then they raised a second specification later on that year, the same year, and they'd reduced the bomb bay to be much more realistic, 5 foot by 5 foot. Much better, but the combat radius had gone up to a whopping 3,400 miles, so it gone from 1,900 miles to 3,400 miles. And they specified an altitude, which was 50,000 feet, and the speed was now 500 knots, which is Mach 0.85. And the specification actually said that it should incorporate a special wing, whatever you may mean by that. It was issued, but there was no urgency because of the 10-year rule. This was this strange belief that we weren't going to have another war for 10 years, so we didn't need to do anything in a hurry. Unfortunately, nobody had told the Russians about that, and we had issues with which required the Berlin airlift, and then, of course, we had the Korean War. But that was there's no great hurry there. There were 3 contenders. First of all was Vickers, then Handley Page, and they got this crescent wing. And I'll talk about that shape in a bit. Then Avro had gone with a pure delta wing. And what happened was that all of a sudden the fears that we seemed to have at the time was that there were always problems with aircraft. For example, the short Stirling, which is this monster, was built, and then they found that it wouldn't fit through the hangar doors, so they had to trim some of the wing tips off, which made it short on wing area. and couldn't lift as much as it should have been doing. The Emperor Manchester, which was this thing, it was again short on wing area. It had two Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. The Vulture was an X24 engine. If you think of the Merlin, which was a V12 engine, you've got two banks of 6 cylinders in a 60-degree V. With the Vulture, you actually had 4 banks of 6 cylinders in an X format with a common crankshaft. Very unreliable, a lot of problems. The other problem they had was with these fins down here, which were just not man enough for good lateral stability. Particularly if you had one of the Vulture engines fail, which they were prone to do, you just couldn't get enough yaw control from these fins here. So they stuck this extra central fin on there. Think of a whole complete mess. And the way they got round it, or the way that Roy Chadwick, the designer, got round it, was to actually do away with the central fin, make these a lot bigger, make the wing a lot longer, do away with the 2 Vulture engines and put in 4 Merlin engines, and then you got the Emperor Lancaster, which was considerably better than this. So there was this kind of worry that we would have, that we couldn't make aircraft. So therefore we're going to have several programs and we'll choose a winner, and that's what we go with. There was also this lack of knowledge on swept-wing aircraft. We hadn't been doing anything. We got all of this data out of Germany, fantastic amount of data on swept-wing aircraft, but we were scared stiff of it. So what the Air Ministry or Farnborough wanted was to build reduced scale aircraft to test the wing shapes, and we're talking about something about a 1/3 scale. We're not talking about little models, we're talking about real flying aeroplanes, but we'd have reduced scale ones to do that. So what happened with the programme? Well, Vickers submitted their design, but it was not adopted because it wasn't advanced enough, so they were told to go away. And a contract was given to, or contracts were given to Handley Page for their Crescent wing design, and Avro for their Delta wing design for a prototype. Then they had worries because this sheer paranoia about wing shapes. We better not put all our eggs in 2 baskets, actually, and we'll resurrect the B-1446, that's the first one, in case the Handley Page and Avro aircraft were both failures. They didn't change the requirement for the 30 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot bomb bay for some reason, but they resurrected this requirement, this specification, and it was given to Short Brothers. This actually stunned a lot of people in the aircraft industry, because Shorts were they were good at flying boats. They produced some stunning ones. The Short Sunderland was an excellent aircraft as a flying boat. Did wonderful things against submarines and all of that. But it was given to Short Brothers. They had a design facility in Kent and a factory in Northern Ireland. Not exactly that good, was it? Also, they were a bit short of capacity, and they came up with this thing, the Short Sperrin. This is the thing which nobody has heard of. Now, it's a pretty conventional aircraft when you actually look at the wing shape. These are conventional straight wings. Nothing really stunning about that. The thing which is immediately obvious, which is a bit unusual, is the way they've mounted the engines. They've gone for 4 Rolls-Royce Avon engines, and they were stacked one on top of the other. Nothing wrong with that, but I think that nobody has really done it since, and so it's a bit of an unusual one. What we don't mention is that it had very advanced electric controls of the control surfaces, but that's not mentioned. Here's another view of it. It's not a pretty aircraft, is it? It's quite an ugly thing, because it's a cargo aircraft with this. It had to have this massive bomb bay in there. The other thing that you've noticed is that it's got a kind of dramatic dihedral on the tailplane, and I assume that's to get rid of the efflux from the jet engines there. Because if you looked at it straight onto the nose, then if the tailplane was horizontal, then it'd be straight in the blast of at least the top engines. They didn't have a wind tunnel, and so they used a water tank. Believe it or not, they towed models in a water tank, and they got it right. But what they thought was it was going to be, they were going to get orders for lots of these, so they produced production jigs. Took them a long time to do that. So as a result, it was quite a long time before the prototype flew, and it flew in August 1951. What had happened, to make it quite irrelevant, is this beastie. They built two aircraft, by the way. Was this beastie, the Vickers Valiant, which is quite a pretty aircraft in my opinion. And what had happened with the Vickers Valiant is that George Edwards from Vickers, a very persuasive guy apparently, but he persuaded the government that his simpler design would be less likely to suffer delays or risks that might be inherent with the Handley Page and the Avro designs. And so the government actually gave them an order written round a specification written around the Vickers aircraft, and the prototype aircraft were built very, very quickly. They used concrete jigs because of the shortage of steel, and because they'd done such wonderful work, they got it flying fairly early. Their chief aerodynamicist, this guy Elvin Richards, had recognised the benefits of the sharper sweep at the wing roots. This is a lot of work that was done by Blom and Voss in Germany during the war, and so the wing roots were, instead of being straight, the first 20% were at 37 degrees and the remainder at 21 degrees. The first prototype used the Rolls-Royce Avon, which at the time was called the AJ65. 65 referring to the 6,500 pound thrust, and it had very narrow slit intakes. The aircraft did. The subsequent aircraft had a derivative of the Avon, of that Avon, but much more thrust, with 9,500 pounds thrust and much larger intakes. So the main undercarriage was two wheels, a strange arrangement, very large wheels, 4 foot diameter, in a bicycle arrangement, that is, one behind the other. And this meant that the undercarriage took up a lot of room in the wing. Fuel capacity was very low, and then because of that they had to fit additional tanks. The wing spars were attached using D650 castings. We didn't know a lot about the behaviour of that particular alloy, aluminium, zinc, copper, magnesium. I've worked a lot on aluminium alloys, and I've never heard of zinc going into that. Lots of alloys use aluminium, copper and magnesium, but not aluminium, zinc, copper, magnesium. But didn't know a lot of fatigue behaviour, and apparently the fatigue behaviour is not very good at all. That's what it looks like. Quite a pretty aircraft there. You'll notice this straight sweep there, which changes to this shallower sweep as you go further out. This is the prototype. You'll notice the very narrow slit intakes here, which are apparently not there, or quite apparently not there, on the subsequent aircrafts, which had a much larger intake. You'll notice from this photograph the undercarriage, which is these very large wings, very large wheels on straight struts like that, and the whole thing folded up into this space there. So it takes up an enormous amount of room in the wing, which meant that we were short of fuel capacity, which meant that we had to put these extra tanks on to give you sufficient fuel capacity. The Americans used to laugh at this. They said that they put their engines on the outside and the fuel on the inside, whereas we put our engines on the inside and the fuel on the outside. The prototype was built at the Vickers factory at Brooklands. The runway there was only 3,000 feet long, and they didn't think that was long enough to get the aircraft off, certainly the prototype aircraft off, not safely anyway. So they transported it, took the wings off it, and transported it to Wisley, just down the road, and this had a 4,700 foot runway, but it was grass, believe it or not. The prototype flew on May 1951. You notice that the short Sperrin flew in August 1951, so this more advanced aircraft flew before the short Sperrin. It flew in May 1951, and it left ruts at Wisley, big enough for a man to walk in, which is not really surprising with these huge wheels there on a grass airfield. And that was enough to make them create a solid runway, a concrete or a tarmac runway at Wisley. The orders were placed for 25 aircraft 1 month before the prototypes made them fly. So they were very keen to get this on. They had a crew of 5, as did all the V bombers, but only the pilots had ejector seats. This goes back to the experience in the Second World War, where if an aircraft was damaged, the crew, apart from the pilot, could get out. They'd go out through the hatch, but the pilot had to sit struggling at the controls to maintain control of the aircraft, and he couldn't get out. So they were going to give him an ejector seat and have the rest of the crew leaving by the door. This philosophy was true of all the V bombers. This was actually tested in January 1952 when the prototype crashed. They were trying multiple engine mid-air restarts, and fuel accumulated, and there was no kind of fire warning at all in the engine bays or anything, which was really strange. And so they had to abandon the aircraft. All the crew escaped, but one of the pilots was killed as the ejector seat struck the tailplane. Obviously they hadn't got that right. And they built 107 aircraft, a lot of aeroplanes. And the British atomic bomb and later the hydrogen bomb tests were all from a Valiant. And this was because it entered service early. That was the only aircraft that was available at the time that we were carrying out these atomic weapon tests. I did hear something on television a few years ago which was all about the atomic bomb tests, and all the British atomic bomb tests, and they said it was from a Valiant because that was the high altitude version of the Vulcan. No, it's not. It's much lower altitude actually, but the Valiant was the aircraft that was available. But it's got the record of being the only British aircraft ever to have dropped a nuclear weapon. Then we had this Pathfinder role, and the government raised a requirement for a Pathfinder version. Now, this had to be able to fly low and travel via a devious route. The Pathfinders during the Second World War were your crack crews. They really knew how to navigate, had good navigational instruments, and they would fly ahead of the main formation, and they would mark the target with flares, incendiaries, some of them coloured, I believe. and that would give something for the main force to aim at. Now that's quite ridiculous for an atomic bomb, and everybody thought that, and so it was ignored by Handley Page and Avro. They just got on with their conventional aircraft, or the aircraft they were doing for high altitude. But Vickers built one prototype, the Valiant B2, and it differed from the B1. First of all, by having conventional four-wheel bogies that retracted backwards into a fairing, the so-called Russian arrangement. And it needed this stronger undercarriage because it was a much heavier aircraft. It uses heavier sections, beefed up all around to cope with the low altitude that you get, or the buffeting you get when you're flying at low altitude. In fact, it was cleared to fly at 580 knots at low level, and had been up to 640 knots at low level. The Valiant B1 was limited to 414 knots at low level because it was much, much weaker. But the high altitude performance was the same as the Valiant B1. So here was a multi-role aircraft. It could fly fast at low altitude and fast at very high altitude. Why not go for the B2 version? 17 were ordered and then cancelled because they realised that possibly we didn't need pathfinders. We needed the capability of flying at low altitude. Anybody could have thought that one out, but they weren't cancelled. I assume that it was done on financial reasons because the B2 must have been more expensive than the B1. For a start, it used more metal because it was, it was a much heavier aircraft. And the other thing was that it had Rolls-Royce Conway engines instead of the Avons. The Avon is a single spool pure turbojet. The Conway is a twin spool bypass engine, much bigger, much meatier, and much more expensive, I assume, engine. That's what it looked like. For some reason they painted the prototype black, but that was it. You'll notice these fairings here. We'll see a bit more of those in detail. And we'll also notice that it's got an extra 4 foot in the fuselage, and that was to bring because it was all the heavy weight that we got further back, particularly with the undercarriage, we needed to actually get a bit more leverage from the weight up front, so we extended the nose out by 4 feet. This is what it looked like on the ground. You can see this much heavier undercarriage here, a much heavier aircraft basically, and you'll see it from this picture here. And the undercarriage actually rotated backwards into the fairings, these fairings at the back. As I said, the Russians like doing this kind of thing on some of their heavy aircraft. They put them into the engine nasals, but here they've got these things purely for the undercarriage. Quite an outstanding aircraft. Could have done an awful lot, but was totally ignored. We don't know why. The Avro Vulcan was originally just a pure delta with engines stacked in 2 pairs in the fuselage and the weapons bay in the wing. Most peculiar arrangement. This is what it looked like. You'll see that the engines are stacked on top of each other there, and it's a very fat wing, absolutely massive. Avro loved this kind of concept of twin fins, so we got the fins at the wingtips. I don't quite know why. And if we look at what it looks like from this view here, or this drawing here, we'll see that the engines are stacked one on top of the other, like that. Slightly in front. The upper ones are slightly in front of the lower ones. but the bomb bays are outside. So we've got, this is the special weapon there, the conventional weapons there. They're further out, which is a strange arrangement, because if you think about what would happen when you release the bomb, not only do you get a change in pitch, but you'd also get a roll one way as the weight of this thing kind of disappeared. And because we'd had this thing, it was very obvious to everybody, in particular the Royal Aircraft Establishment, that it was too fat. The wing was too fat. It'd have too much drag to attain high speed. So what Avros then did was to change the arrangement. They reduced the thickness of the wings. You didn't need them to be that thick. They moved the engines into the wing roots and had them side by side, pretty much the same as the Valiant. They moved the weapons bay into the fuselage, which made sense there, and we had a single fin. Much better arrangement here. Right, so that was, the conventional, what we know as the Vulcan now arrangement. Because the RAE was scared stiff of this arrangement, scared stiff of wings, they were going to have wanted a reduced scale aircraft to test the low and high speed characteristics of Delta wings before the full-size prototype was finished. So first of all, we had this thing, which was the Avro 707, had a single engine there, and it was to test the low speed characteristics, which it did very well, and it proved that they got it right. It was fine at low speed, no trouble at all. Here's another view of it. And then there was this one, which was originally to test the high-speed characteristics, and I assume they wanted to get away from the kind of interference you get by having the air intakes in the wing root, so they have this dorsal intake, the most peculiar arrangement here. But what that did was that the cockpit there screwed up the airflow that's going into the air intake there, and so it made it very poor. So they had to rework this, and they put the engine intakes back into this area here. And by the time that had been done, there was no high-speed flying prior to the prototype flying. So all this was basically a complete waste of the time. Though it was used as a test aircraft when they modified the wing shape. So before they modified the wing shape on the Vulcan B2s, they tried it out on this one. The prototype flew in August 1953. It had a fighter-style joystick instead of the conventional yoke, and this was supposedly because it was so agile. And it was very agile as well. It's demonstrated at Farnborough, where the test pilot, Rolly Falk, barrel rolled it in front of everybody. Rolly Falk was a great salesman, by the way. He's now chief test pilot, but he used to fly in a pinstripe suit. He would have lunch and sell things, obviously not drinking alcohol at lunch. He was a great salesman in his pinstripe suit, and then walk out to the aircraft still wearing his pinstripe suit. He was known for this. It was originally fitted with the Olympus 100 series engines. That's the 101 and 104, which had 10,000 pounds thrust. Then Bristol beefed this up. They got more and more out of the 100 series engines, and it became the 200 series engines, 17,000 pounds thrust. And then they, I think, fitted a zero stage to that and produced the 300 series engines. That's the 301, 20,000 pounds thrust. So, twice the thrust of the original engines. This is what the prototype looks like. This is what we think of as the Vulcan, a pretty aircraft like that. However, when with the higher thrust of the Olympus 201 engines resulted in higher speed, as you may expect, and they started to experience leading edge buffet. And if they'd kept flying at that kind of speed, then it would have reduced the fatigue life. And the cure was to change the wings leading edge to have a decreased sweep from about 40 degree span, and then an increased sweep from about 8 degree span, and also for that extra bit to have a droop. You can see this. So this is the increased span, and then the increased sweep. Reduced sweep and then increased sweep, and you can see this droop here. And this next picture, I do apologise, but it is scanned from a book, but you'll actually see how this does droop there, this extra bit. You can see the, if you like, the crease just there. You can also see how filthy some of these engines were. They had problems with the intakes. They caused engine handling difficulties, and not surprisingly, the inner and outboard engines had different performance because they were sharing the same air, but also the port engines behaved differently to the starboard engines because of the rotation of the spool. Incredible, really. And they tried various things. You'll see here where they put these vortex generators, and you notice they can be bolted in different configurations. So these are bolted differently to these, and they tried them out, and they found that it improved things, but not sufficiently to actually put them onto actual aircraft engines in service. It had a standoff roll, which was an airborne atomic weapon. So instead of actually flying over the target, you dropped it some distance from the target and then went back, and this, which was basically a cruise missile, went on and carried the nuclear part of it to its destination. This is the Blue Steel, which was a British missile. These fins, by the way, do fold up, because you'd have to fold up to take off, and there's another one in there which is folded up, so you can actually get it under the aircraft. But the Americans said, no, we've got this wonderful thing, and this is the Skybolt, and wonderful missile, much better. It could carry two of these. They weren't slung under the fuselage, they were slung under the wings, and that's why we went for the 301 engines on the Olympus 301s. It was to carry the Skybolt. But having scrapped our Blue Steel missile, done away with it all, the Americans under McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defence, scrapped the Skybolt program. So that all went, and we never flew with the Skybolt. This shows Vulcans in their primary role, which thankfully was never needed, but this was their quick reaction alert. If you go on Google Maps and look at places like Cottesmore or Scampton, you will still see these 45 degree parking bays. And what happened there was the aircraft were right at the end of the runway, ready to take off. The crews actually stayed in caravans here, so the crews were there, and you could get off the ground in less than 4 minutes. You could run into the aircraft, press the button, all the engines would start off, and off it goes. They were, let's say, ready 4 aircraft off the ground in 4 minutes. Thankfully, we never needed that. And that's what it looked like. It's a thing we all recognise now with this different shape of sweep of those wings. Produced 136 aircraft, because instead of actually choosing a winner, we dithered between the Vulcan and the Victor, which I'm just about to talk about, and we produced lots of different aircraft, so 136 of these. This was a Handley Page Victor. Handley Page, Sir Fred Handley Page was still around, still alive at the time, and he had always been put out by what happened with the Avro Manchester and the Handley Page Halifax. The Handley Page Halifax was an excellent aircraft, but because and much better than the Avro Manchester. But when Avro reconfigured the Manchester by putting in 4 Merlins instead of the Vultures, extending the wings and changing the fin configuration, they produced the Lancaster, which then eclipsed the Handley Page Halifax. Now, Sir Fred wasn't having that, and he put a lot of effort into producing an outstanding aircraft, the Handley Page Victor. The wing configuration was this so-called crescent configuration. You keep the you need quite a sharp feedback where the wing is thick. If you had a lower feedback, then the critical Mach number would be quite low. But if you had a sharp feedback, then then the critical Mach number could be kept low at the wing root. As the wing got thinner, as you got further out, you didn't need that amount of sweepback, so you could actually reduce it. And so we've got this arrangement here. As I say, a lot of the work came out of Blom and Voss, and who'd done it in Germany in the Second World War, but we pinched those ideas. The so-called crescent wing layout. I think Sir Fred had been kind of taken by Dande Comics and such like. So this actual comic arrangement looks like cockpit arrangements look like something out of a comic. It's quite interesting that that there's this quite large arrangement there, but then it goes to be quite shallow under the fuselage there. So we've got this large bulb at the front, and then it goes shallow. I don't know if they'd discovered area rule by that time, but that and the thinning of the fuselage here, the wasting of the fuselage, actually follows the area rule. And it also gives you somewhere to tuck a blue steel missile. Originally they weren't going to have a tailplane on it, but they decided to put a tailplane on it, and they put this rather elegant swept back tailplane with a dihedral. Quite why it's that format I don't know, but it's rather beautiful. And so you end up with this, or you ended up with the Victor. Prior to the Victor flying, we had this, which was the HP-88, which was a reduced scale test aircraft for the crescent wing. You'll notice it's got these crescent wings on it. What they've done is they've taken a Supermarine attacker fuselage and bolted different wings and this tailplane arrangement to it. The RAE were worried about stick movements being too sharp, so they insisted that a bob weight was added to the joystick, which was a crazy thing really, because you got a first degree problem, and you added a second degree control to that. It's not the way to do it. And what actually happened was you got cross coupling between the movement of the aircraft and this horrible joystick with lots of inertia on it, and the prototype aircraft crashed. So we didn't actually get any information off it. Also, the wing shape was slightly different. This is the Vulcan flying as we know it. Rather beautiful aircraft. And here's another one. It looks like something out of space, doesn't it, with this particular kind of arrangement there. Now, doesn't that look rather malevolent? Very, very much a kind of threatening aircraft there. These funny things up here disappeared, by the way, when it was off the ground. And you'll notice from this one that you'll see this large diameter bit of the fuselage there goes to a much narrower diameter here, and that's had the offset benefit of being able to tuck this blue steel missile into it, as shown there. It's a very roomy aircraft. And this is one, obviously, it's taken of one in when it was scrapped, but you could see just how roomy it was. A lot of space there. I think this is the fuel panel there, and the throttles are further in when this moves backwards. But a very roomy aircraft compared with the Vulcan, and this was a very, very tight, very, very cramped aircraft. You know, two pilots cramped in here. To get in, you had to move this fuel tray out of the way to actually get in. And you couldn't have this yoke tie arrangement. You had to have this joystick. It's the only way you could actually get any kind of space in there. Very cramped aircraft, which was strange for something which you'd normally think of as a big aeroplane. The Conway originally had the Astrom Sigley Sapphire engines, 11,000 pounds thrust, but then were beefed up with the Conways, going up to 20,000 pound thrust. 86 aircraft were built. One did actually go supersonic, by the way, in a shallow dive. Now, if we compare them, these are drawings which I've adjusted so they are to the same scale. We think of the Vulcan as being a very big aeroplane, but actually it's quite a baby compared to the other ones. It's much smaller than the Victor. Victor's much longer, particularly when you actually take into account the tailplane there, and the Valiant is bigger than the Vulcan, and the Sperrin is monumentally ugly and much bigger than the Vulcan. So the Vulcan, although you think of it as a big aeroplane, is actually quite small in comparison. And if we look at the kind of performance, what I've done is to say that the circles are the ceilings and the triangles are the range. Now the Sperrin was obviously very limited. It could do, you know, about 480, 490 knots or so, and could only go up to about 44,000 feet, 40,000 feet. Very low range as well. The Victor was, the Valiant was much better, much higher ceiling, so we're talking about the 55,000 feet ceiling. The range was you know, about 4,500 miles, which was great. Speed was of the order of, I don't know, 570, 580 knots. And then you compare it with the Vulcan and the Victor, both of which have the same range as the Valiant, because that's what they were designed around, but their speed and their ceiling was much, much greater. So they were both doing something of the order of 650, 660 knots. So the Victor could actually do a bit more than that. The Vulcan could actually get to a higher ceiling. So we're talking about something of the order of 64,000 feet or so. Vulcan was much bigger wing area, could get much higher. But this is the concept was, you fly very high, very fast and very high, and you'd be out of trouble. But then I show you this line here, and that line is where this aircraft was flying. This is the U-2, high altitude research aircraft, and that was flying at that kind of height, a height higher than that of the Vulcan or the Victor could reach when it flying over Russia, when it met one of these things and was shot down. The pilot was captured. Great international incident there with the Gary Powers incident there. So it was quite obvious, it had become obvious that that this concept of flying high and fast wasn't going to work. Sure, fighter aircraft couldn't get up there, but missiles could. And so the requirements changed, and the end of the program was because flying high and flying fast was no defence, they had to fly low. The Victors have been upgraded for higher altitude, by the way. The wings and tips have been extended, but that was no good. So the tactics were changed to fly at low level, for which the B bomber hadn't been designed. They'd been designed for high altitude work. The Valiant had been designed Valiant B1 had been designed for high altitude only, and cracks started appearing in the Valiant. And then we had a major problem with WP Whiskey Papa 217, which was flying, and the crew experienced a bang which they thought was a collision. It sounded like a collision. They managed to land the aircraft, and when the aircraft was on the ground, they found that the wing of one of the aircraft was sagging very badly at the back because the rear spar, the drag spar, had snapped. How they managed to actually fly it to land it, I don't know. And the Valiant B2 would have been ideal for this, but had not been ordered, and so they scrapped all the Valiants were scrapped. They could have re-winged it, but they chose not to. The Victors had their wings clipped to reduce the fatigue life, but then they were changed to a tanker roll. But the Vulcan was able to carry on because it had a very thick and rigid wing, and it was able to control at low level. And then the nuclear deterrent was changed to the Polaris missile and the derivatives of that, so we didn't need a nuclear bomber anymore. The Vulcan was about to be retired, and it was just saved in the nick of time for the black buck raids on in the Falklands when it took out the runway at Port Stanley. And that is the end of the Victor. It ended life as a tanker. It did enormously good work in being able to refuel with the system that we had, that the British had. You could refuel 3 aircraft at once, and that was it. So that is the end of the V bombers. None of them are flying anymore. The 3 that you really want to see are at the museum at Cosford, RAF Cosford. All 3 of them are there. Well worth going to, well worth seeing. Right, that's the end of that. Thank you.